On the morning of June 3, 1995, the peaceful suburban town of Maplewood, New Jersey, was shattered by a gruesome discovery in an upscale home at the edge of town. Alicia Thompson, a 47-year-old housewife, was found brutally murdered in her kitchen. Her body lay sprawled across the floor, blood pooling around her head from what appeared to be multiple blows to the skull. It was her daughter, Emily Thompson, 19 years old and home for summer break from college, who made the horrifying discovery. She had returned from an early morning run and found her mother lifeless on the kitchen floor. Distraught, Emily called 911, her voice trembling as she begged for help. The crime shocked the local community. The Thompson family was well known and well liked, but as investigators began to delve into the case, they quickly realized this was not a typical home invasion or a random act of violence. Alicia Thompson's death was personal, intensely personal. The web of secrets that emerged would leave everyone involved questioning who they could trust. On the surface, the Thompson family appeared to be the epitome of suburban success. Mark Thompson, Alicia's husband of 25 years, was a successful real estate developer, known for his business acumen and involvement in local charity work. Alicia, a homemaker, was deeply involved in the community, volunteering at local schools and churches. Their daughter, Emily, was a promising student at Rutgers University, pursuing a degree in psychology. To their neighbors, the Thompsons were the perfect family. They lived in a spacious, well-maintained home on Maple Avenue, drove expensive cars, and hosted holiday parties that everyone wanted an invitation to. But as detectives would soon discover, beneath the polished exterior, there were cracks in the foundation, cracks that would eventually lead to murder. When the police arrived at the Thompson residence that morning, they were greeted with a gruesome scene. Alicia had been bludgeoned to death with a blunt object, later determined to be a fireplace poker. The murder weapon lay discarded on the floor next to her body, smeared with blood. The kitchen was in disarray. Cabinet doors left open, a broken glass on the floor, but there were no signs of forced entry. It didn't look like a robbery, this was something else. Detective Karen Mills, the lead investigator from the Maplewood Police Department, immediately suspected that the crime was personal. "Whoever did this knew Alicia," she later remarked in an interview. "This kind of violence doesn't come from a stranger breaking into your house. It comes from someone with rage, someone with a motive." Detectives began by questioning Emily, who was visibly shaken and struggling to comprehend what had happened. Through sobs, she explained that she had gone out for a jog around 6:30 a.m. and returned about an hour later to find her mother's body. She hadn't seen or heard anything unusual while she was out. The timeline was tight. Whoever had killed Alicia had done so within a small window of time while Emily was out of the house. But if this was a targeted attack, who could have wanted Alicia dead? The detective's first thought was Mark Thompson, Alicia's husband, who had been out of town on a business trip at the time of the murder. Could his alibi be airtight? Or was there something more sinister lurking beneath the surface of the Thompson family's perfect facade? Detective Mills, a seasoned investigator with over 2 decades of experience, knew time was of the essence. From the moment she entered the house, it was clear this was not a typical home invasion or burglary gone wrong. The lack of forced entry suggested Alicia likely knew her killer. Mills immediately turned her attention to Mark Thompson, the first obvious suspect. Husbands are often the first to be scrutinized in cases like this. The detectives wasted no time verifying his alibi. Mark was attending a real estate conference in Philadelphia, and at first glance, his alibi appeared solid. Hotel records confirmed his check-in the night before the murder, and witnesses at the conference recalled seeing him at a networking event that evening. His credit card statements matched his timeline, showing charges for room service late at night. While this initially seemed airtight, Mills knew that appearances could be deceiving. She also knew that hired hands could carry out murders, so she couldn't rule Mark out entirely just yet. The neighbors described the Thompsons as a loving family. Yet when Margaret Blake, their next-door neighbor, mentioned hearing a heated argument the night before the murder. Detective Mills became intrigued. The raised voices lasted only a few minutes, but they were enough to suggest that something had gone wrong inside the house. Alicia was reportedly home alone. So who could she have been arguing with? Suspicion began to turn toward Emily Thompson, the couple's daughter. Emily, who found the body, seemed devastated and in shock. But it wouldn't be the first time a family member was involved in a homicide. Detectives considered whether Emily could have been involved knowingly or unknowingly. They requested cell phone records from Emily, Mark, and anyone else closely connected to the family, hoping for a digital trail that would unravel the timeline of events. Then, there was Daniel Reynolds, Emily's 20-year-old boyfriend. Daniel had been close to the family for over a year, and his relationship with Emily had been a point of contention between mother and daughter. Alicia had reportedly been unhappy with her daughter's choice in men, citing Daniel's troubled past. Friends and neighbors hinted that Alicia had disapproved of Daniel, and Emily was often caught between the two. Detectives wondered if this conflict had reached a breaking point. The next steps for Detective Mills and her team were clear. They needed to dive into Daniel's background and find out where he had been the night of the murder. Daniel Reynolds became the focus of the investigation as detectives began piecing together the timeline of his whereabouts. The first thing they did was track down Daniel's alibi. Daniel claimed to have been at home on the morning of the murder, sleeping in late after a night out with friends. His roommate, Kyle Marshall, corroborated his story, stating that Daniel had been at their shared apartment all night and hadn't left until mid-morning. But there were holes in this alibi. Phone records showed a flurry of late-night text messages exchanged between Daniel and Emily, none of which aligned with his account of being asleep. Detectives knew that young people often relied on social media and texting for communication, and Daniel's evasive behavior during questioning was a red flag. When pressed, Daniel admitted that he had left the apartment briefly, but only to pick up food from a nearby convenience store. However, no charges were made to his debit card, and no one from the store remembered seeing him that night. Then came the cell phone tower records, which painted an even more damning picture. Daniel's phone pinged off a cell tower near the Thompson house between 11:30 p.m. and 12:30 a.m., placing him in the vicinity at the same time neighbors heard the argument. He had not mentioned being near the house that night, and this omission raised more questions than answers. Daniel's history with the law also made him a person of interest. He had been arrested twice for minor drug offenses, and he was known to have a temper. Friends of Emily described him as jealous and possessive, particularly when it came to her friendships with other men. Alicia's dislike of Daniel was well known, and detectives were left to wonder if this animosity had spiraled into something far more dangerous. Tensions between them had been building for months. This tension created a potential motive, but it was still unclear how deep their conflict ran. Detectives started looking into Daniel's finances, hoping to uncover any connections to a potential motive. What they found was troubling. Daniel had recently made large withdrawals from his bank account, but the funds couldn't be traced back to any legitimate expenses. Was he paying someone off, or was he buying time for something more nefarious? Meanwhile, Alicia's friends were interviewed, and several of them mentioned that Alicia had been stressed and distant in recent months. She had hinted at family problems, but no one could have imagined the depths of the secrets that were about to emerge. The investigation was slowly building a case against Daniel, but something was still missing, a link that tied everything together. Detective Mills knew that cell phone records often held the key to uncovering hidden relationships. When the forensic team sifted through Alicia's call logs, they found something startling. Alicia had been in frequent contact with Daniel Reynolds, Emily's boyfriend, for weeks before her death. The conversations weren't casual. They were late at night and unusually long. This was highly suspicious, given that Daniel hadn't mentioned any such interactions during questioning. Why had Alicia and Daniel been in contact without Emily's knowledge? Detectives dug deeper into Daniel's phone records and text message history, uncovering a digital trail that revealed something shocking. Alicia and Daniel had been involved in a secret affair for several months. The affair was documented in a series of flirty text messages, intimate phone calls, and covert meetings at motel rooms outside of town. One particularly incriminating text from Alicia read, "We need to stop. It's getting too dangerous." Another from Daniel said, "I don't want this to end, but we can't let anyone find out." Detective Mills was stunned. This changed the entire trajectory of the case. Alicia had been having an affair with her daughter's boyfriend, a man she openly disapproved of. The emotional tension between Alicia and Daniel had now reached a new level of complexity. What had started as a power struggle over Emily had evolved into something far more insidious. Was it possible that Alicia had wanted to end the affair, and Daniel had lashed out in a fit of rage? Or had the affair been discovered by someone else, leading to a tragic confrontation? The more the detectives examined the timeline, the more the affair seemed like the most likely motive for the murder. To complicate matters, Emily Thompson remained unaware of her mother's betrayal. She had no idea that the two people closest to her had been hiding such a devastating secret. Detectives wondered if the truth about the affair would push Emily to seek revenge, or if she was already involved without realizing it. As they continued to unravel the truth, Detective Mills and her team realized they needed to confront Daniel again. His alibi was falling apart, and now, with this explosive new information, they were ready to push him harder than ever. With the discovery of Alicia's affair, the case had taken a dramatic turn. But Daniel Reynolds wasn't the only one who had a motive. Detective Mills began to wonder if Mark Thompson, Alicia's husband, could have found out about the affair and orchestrated the murder. Mark had a rock-solid alibi, but people of his means often had ways of outsourcing crimes to avoid direct involvement. Could he have hired someone to kill his wife in a crime of passion? Mark's financial records revealed that he had recently taken out a large sum of money, $50,000 in cash, just weeks before Alicia's murder. When asked about this, Mark claimed it was for business investments. But detectives couldn't ignore the possibility that it could have been used to pay someone to commit the crime. Then there was the mystery of the argument heard the night before the murder. If Alicia and Daniel had been in a secret relationship, it was possible they had argued on the night of June 2nd. But what about the detective's speculation that Alicia might have been trying to end the affair, worried that it was spiraling out of control and could destroy her family? Perhaps Daniel, driven by jealousy and fear of losing both Alicia and Emily, had snapped. But just as the case seemed to be heading toward a clear conclusion, a new twist emerged. Forensic evidence from Alicia's cell phone showed that the last person she had texted before her death wasn't Daniel, but Emily. In the early hours of the morning, Alicia had sent her daughter a brief message. "We need to talk. It's about Daniel." Emily hadn't mentioned this text during her initial interviews with detectives. Why was she hiding something? The detectives began to entertain the possibility that Emily had found out about the affair. Could she have been the one arguing with Alicia that night? If Emily had discovered the betrayal, it could provide a powerful motive for murder. To complicate matters further, Daniel's alibi was beginning to crumble. Forensic analysis of his car revealed traces of blood in the trunk, and a pair of sneakers matching the partial footprint found at the crime scene was discovered hidden in his apartment. The blood was a match for Alicia, and suddenly Daniel's involvement seemed undeniable. But as detectives closed in on Daniel, they couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to the story. The affair, the hidden phone records, the conflicting alibis, none of it seemed to fit together perfectly. Someone was lying, but who and why? Daniel Reynolds was now their prime suspect, but detectives still had lingering doubts. Why hadn't he fled? Why hadn't he tried harder to cover his tracks? If he was responsible for Alicia's murder, he had the motive, but his behavior didn't align with the typical actions of a guilty man. Detective Mills had been in law enforcement long enough to know when something didn't feel right. With search warrants in hand, detectives scoured Daniel's apartment for further evidence. They found Alicia's necklace tucked away in a drawer, a small silver pendant that Emily recognized as her mother's favorite. This was the first piece of physical evidence directly linking Daniel to Alicia's personal life. It was clear now that their relationship had been more than just a fleeting affair. It had been serious. But the most significant discovery came from Daniel's laptop. Buried in his email account were multiple messages exchanged between him and an unknown third party, discussing Alicia in alarming detail. One message in particular stood out. "She's getting suspicious. We need to take care of this before it blows up." The detectives were stunned. Daniel hadn't been working alone. Someone else had been involved, someone who had just as much to lose as Daniel did if the affair was exposed. But who was this unknown person? And what was their role in Alicia's death? As they traced the email account, they discovered it belonged to none other than Kyle Marshall, Daniel's roommate. Kyle, who had provided Daniel's alibi, had been involved in the cover-up from the start. The two had conspired to keep the affair hidden. But when Alicia threatened to reveal everything, they decided to silence her permanently. The revelation shocked detectives, who had believed Kyle to be nothing more than a casual bystander in the investigation. It became clear that Kyle had played a central role in orchestrating the murder, while Daniel had been the one to carry it out. Detective Mills now had enough evidence to arrest both Daniel and Kyle, but she wanted a confession. She brought Daniel in for another round of questioning, laying out the evidence piece by piece: the blood, the sneakers, the necklace, and finally, the emails. Under pressure, Daniel finally broke down. Daniel's confession was chilling. He revealed that the affair with Alicia had started innocently enough: secretive glances, flirtatious texts, but it had quickly spiraled out of control. Alicia had become emotionally attached, and Daniel, despite his initial excitement, had begun to feel trapped. When Alicia threatened to end the relationship and tell Emily everything, Daniel panicked. He confided in his roommate Kyle, who had been aware of the affair for months. Together, they devised a plan to confront Alicia and convince her to stay silent. But when Daniel arrived at the Thompson house that night, things quickly escalated. Alicia refused to back down, insisting that she would tell Emily the truth. Enraged, Daniel grabbed the fireplace poker and, in a moment of blind rage, struck Alicia multiple times. Kyle had helped Daniel clean up the crime scene, wiping down the murder weapon and disposing of incriminating evidence. They had hoped the police would assume it was a botched robbery or a random act of violence, but they hadn't counted on the detectives uncovering the web of lies they had spun. In the end, Daniel admitted that he had loved Alicia, but his fear of losing both her and Emily had driven him to commit the unthinkable. Kyle, on the other hand, had acted out of self-preservation, fearing that the affair would ruin both of their lives if it came to light. Daniel Reynolds and Kyle Marshall were both charged with first-degree murder. After a highly publicized trial, both were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The revelation of Alicia's affair with her daughter's boyfriend sent shockwaves through the Maplewood community, and Emily Thompson, heartbroken by the betrayal, moved away from the town she had called home. Emily's relationship with her father, Mark, became strained as they both struggled to cope with the enormity of what had happened. Mark eventually sold the family home and relocated to a quieter town, far from the media attention and haunting memories. The case of Alicia Thompson's murder would go down as one of the most shocking and tragic in New Jersey history, a story of love, betrayal, and violence that tore a family apart. The affair, hidden for so long, had led to a grisly murder that no one could have predicted. In the end, the secrets that Alicia and Daniel had tried so hard to keep hidden became the catalyst for a tragedy that destroyed multiple lives.